The day the bank man rode up to Lillian Ellsworth's property, the Kansas sky was the color of old pewter, and the wind carried the smell of coming rain across the flat prairie like a warning that nobody had bothered to listen to. Lillian was at the fence line mending a broken post when she heard the sound of hooves on the dry road that cut through her property from the main trail. She straightened up slowly, one hand pressing against the small of her back where the ache had lived since last winter, and she watched the rider come. He was a neat little man on a clean horse, which told her everything she needed to know before he even opened his mouth. Out here in Comanche County, in the year of our Lord 1883, clean horses belonged to men who did not do their own work. She was 31 years old and had been a widow for 14 months. Her husband, Daniel Ellsworth, had died of a fever that swept through their part of Kansas in the spring of '82, leaving her with 240 acres of struggling wheat and sorghum, a leaky roof, a mule named Jasper, and a debt to the Coldwater savings and loan that had seemed manageable when Daniel was alive and working the land beside her. It did not feel manageable now. The neat little man's name was Horace Webb, and he worked for Coldwater Savings and Loan as what he called an account representative. Lillian called him something else in her mind as he dismounted near her fence and pulled a thick envelope from his coat pocket. "Mrs. Ellsworth," he said, tipping his hat in the way that men tip their hats when they are about to do something they know is unkind. "I have some papers here that require your attention." Lillian peeled off her work gloves finger by finger. "You rode all the way out here on a Tuesday to deliver papers. The bank felt it was important that you receive these personally." He held the envelope out toward her across the top rail of the fence. "There is a foreclosure notice inside, Mrs. Ellsworth. The loan on this property is now 90 days in arrears, and the bank is initiating proceedings to reclaim the land and any improvements thereon. You have 30 days from the date on that notice to vacate or to make full payment of the outstanding balance." Lillian looked at the envelope for a long moment. The wind lifted a strand of her dark brown hair across her face, and she did not move to push it back. She thought about Daniel, who had broken this ground with his own hands. She thought about the first winter she and Daniel had spent here, huddled together under every blanket they owned while the ice cracked against the window glass. She thought about her daughter, Clara, who was 9 years old and had never known any home but this one. She took the envelope. Horace Webb mounted his clean horse and rode away, and Lillian stood at the fence with the envelope in her hand until his dust had settled back into the road. She brought the foreclosure notice into the house that evening after Clara was in bed. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time, reading every word of it by the light of the oil lamp. The language was dense and formal and cold, the kind of language that turned a human life and all its years of labor into numbers and dates and legal proceedings. The outstanding balance was $412. It might as well have been $4,000. She had $11 in the coffee tin above the stove. She read it twice. Then she read it a third time as if the words might change themselves into something more bearable. They did not. She stood up from the table, crossed to the wood stove, and opened the iron door. The fire inside was burning low, but it was still there, orange and steady and patient. She held the foreclosure notice by one corner and touched the edge of it to the coals. The paper caught immediately, edges curling black, and then the whole thing going up in a clean, bright flame that lit her face for just a moment before she released it into the belly of the stove and closed the door. She did not feel triumphant. She did not feel foolish. She felt the way she imagined a person feels when they have made a decision that does not solve anything but that still had to be made. She went to bed and lay in the dark listening to the wind press against the house, and she thought about what she was going to do next. What she was going to do next turned out to be harder to figure out than she had hoped. In the days that followed, Lillian drove Jasper into the town of Coldwater twice, trying to speak to anyone at the bank who might be willing to discuss alternative arrangements. The bank manager, a man named Hargrove with a gold watch chain, and opinions about women managing property alone, told her politely but with great finality that the bank was not in the business of renegotiating terms simply because a borrower found themselves in difficult circumstances. He said the word circumstances the way people say it when they mean the circumstances are of your own making, and therefore not my problem. She asked at the general store if there was work available. There was not. She asked at the boarding house. There was not. She wrote a letter to her sister in Missouri, but her sister had 4 children of her own and a husband who barely kept them fed, and even as Lillian sealed the envelope she knew she was writing into an empty well. The wheat would not be ready to harvest until late summer, and even if it came in strong, which was not guaranteed given the dry spring, it would not fetch enough to cover the full balance in time. The 30 days were going to run out before any harvest came in, and Lillian knew it. She was 3 weeks into her 30 days when Frank Monroe first appeared on the road to her property. She saw him from the porch that morning, a rider coming from the east at an easy pace on a big roan horse. He was not a small man. Even at that distance she could see the breadth of his shoulders, the easy way he sat in the saddle that spoke of someone who had spent a very large portion of his life on horseback. He wore a plain brown hat, a work coat that had seen real weather, and he had the look of a man who was going somewhere specific, not just passing through. He turned up her road. Lillian stepped off the porch and stood in the yard with her arms folded, not hostile exactly but not welcoming either. Clara appeared in the doorway behind her and Lillian said without turning around, "Go inside and stay there until I call you." The rider came up to the edge of the yard and stopped. He touched his hat brim and said, "Morning, ma'am. I am looking for the Ellsworth property. I believe this is it." "It is," Lillian said. "And you are?" "Frank Monroe. I work out of the Rocking T Ranch, about 12 miles north. I was sent over by Mr. Thaddeus Crane, who owns the Rocking T." He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. "Mr. Crane asked me to deliver this personally." Lillian had a complicated feeling about envelopes just then, but she took it and opened it. Inside was a letter in a careful hand that introduced itself as being from Thaddeus Crane, who described himself as an old acquaintance of Daniel Ellsworth's from their years in Texas, before Daniel had come north to farm. The letter said that Thaddeus Crane had heard of Daniel's passing, was deeply sorry for her loss, and had learned through the talk that circulated in any small county that she might be in need of seasonal labor to bring in her wheat. He was offering to send 2 of his ranch hands to help her with the harvest, at no charge, in memory of Daniel, who had once pulled Thaddeus Crane's brother out of a burning barn in Abilene and never asked for anything in return. Lillian read the letter twice. When she looked up, Frank Monroe was watching her with dark brown eyes that held a kind of steady, patient quality she had not seen in a man's face in a very long time. He had a strong jaw with a few days of dark stubble on it, and there was a scar above his left eyebrow that had healed crooked, like most things healed out here. "Mr. Crane sends this kindness," she said carefully, "and what does he get in return?" Frank Monroe did not look offended by the question, which she appreciated. "Nothing, far as I know. He told me Daniel Ellsworth was one of the finest men he ever knew and that Daniel's wife shouldn't be left holding the whole weight of it alone." He paused. "I am one of the 2 hands he is sending if you will accept the offer." "And the other?" "A man named Pete Odell. He is a good worker, quiet, does what he is asked." Lillian looked out at her wheat field, which stretched away from the house in uneven green rows that rippled in the morning breeze. They were maybe 3.5 weeks from harvest. If she could get the crop in early and sell it fast, there was a chance, a small but real chance, that she might be able to make a partial payment that would at least slow the bank's proceedings. It was not a plan so much as a hope dressed up as a plan, but it was what she had. "All right," she said. "I accept Mr. Crane's offer. You and Mr. Odell are welcome here. I can offer meals and a place to sleep in the barn." Frank Monroe nodded, and for just a moment something shifted in his expression, Not quite a smile, but something warm and quiet. "We will be here Thursday morning, Mrs. Ellsworth." He turned his horse and rode back up the road the way he had come, and Lillian watched him go with the letter still in her hand, thinking that there was something about the way that man sat on a horse that made the world seem slightly less hostile than it had seemed an hour ago. Clara appeared at her side, having decided that the staying inside order had expired. She was a small girl with her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn chin, and she craned her neck to watch the retreating rider with open curiosity. "Who was that?" "A man named Frank Monroe," Lillian said. "He is going to help us with the harvest." "He is very big," Clara observed. "He is," Lillian agreed. "His horse is nice." "It is a good horse," Lillian said, and she went back inside to figure out what she was going to feed 2 extra men for the weeks it would take to get her wheat in. Frank Monroe and Pete Odell arrived on Thursday as promised, Pete on a stocky gray horse and Frank on the same roan that Lillian had already privately named Red in her head, though she would never have said so. Pete Odell was a lean, weathered man of about 50 with a salt and pepper beard, and the hands of someone who had worked outside for 30 years without complaint. He said very little, but he worked like 2 men, and by the end of the first day Lillian had decided she liked him considerably. Frank Monroe was something else entirely, and Lillian was trying very hard not to think about what that something else was. He was 34 years old, which she learned by accident when Pete made a comment about Frank's birthday having just passed, and Frank told him to mind his own business in a tone that told her the subject embarrassed him. He was from Texas originally, born and raised near San Antonio, and had been working cattle and horses for most of his adult life. He knew land. He walked through her wheat fields on that first morning with an eye that was not a farmer's eye exactly, but that was the eye of someone who understood the relationship between the ground and what grew from it. And he asked her questions about soil and rainfall and drainage that made her realize he was actually trying to understand what she had here and what it needed. "Your southeast corner is wet," he told her that first afternoon. He was standing at the edge of the field with his thumbs hooked in his belt and his hat pushed back on his head. "The drainage is running wrong. If you get a heavy rain before harvest, you might lose the crop in that corner." "I know," Lillian said. "Daniel was planning to fix the drainage last fall. He didn't get the chance." There was a brief silence. Frank Monroe had the good grace not to fill it with meaningless words. "I can fix it," he said instead simply. "Won't take more than a day. Better to do it now before the rains come." "You came here to help with the harvest," she said, "not to do my drainage work." "Mrs. Ellsworth," he said, and he looked at her with those steady brown eyes that she was beginning to find somewhat inconvenient. "If the crop in that corner rots before we cut it, there is less harvest to help with. It makes sense to fix the drainage." She could not argue with that. "All right," she said. "Thank you." He nodded and went to get the necessary tools, and Lillian watched him walk away and told herself firmly that she was not watching him walk away for any reason other than to see that he was heading in the right direction. The work fell into a rhythm over the following days. Frank and Pete were up before dawn, doing whatever needed doing without being asked, and Lillian matched them hour for hour, not because she felt she had to prove anything, but because this was her land and she had never been the kind of woman who stood to the side while others worked it. She cooked breakfast and supper and a midday meal that she brought out to the field in a basket, and she worked beside them in the wheat from mid-morning until the light gave out. Clara took to both men in the way that children take to people who are genuine with them. Pete taught her to play checkers and let her win exactly often enough that she stayed interested without figuring out that he was doing it. Frank, for his part, was respectful and careful with the girl in a way that Lillian noticed and appreciated. He never talked down to Clara, and when she asked him questions, which she did constantly and without mercy, he answered them straight. One evening Clara asked him if he had ever been shot, and he said yes, once in the shoulder, and it had hurt considerably. Clara asked if he had cried, and he said he most certainly had not cried in front of anyone, but that he had done some very undignified things with his face when he thought he was alone. Clara found this so funny that she laughed until she had to hold her sides, and Lillian looked up from the dishes she was drying and found Frank Monroe grinning at the little girl's laughter, with an expression on his face that did something warm and uncomfortable to the inside of Lillian's chest. She kept her distance, or she tried to. It was difficult when two people were working the same ground for 12 hours a day. On the fifth evening, after Pete had gone to the barn and Clara was in bed, Frank stayed at the kitchen table a little longer than usual, drinking the last of his coffee. Lillian was mending a piece of harness leather at the other end of the table, and there was a comfortable quiet between them that she was trying not to pay too much attention to. "Can I ask you something?" Frank said. "You can ask," Lillian said. "What are you going to do with the money from the harvest?" She looked up at him. The oil lamp threw warm light across his face, and he was watching her with an expression that was direct without being intrusive. She put down the harness leather and considered how much to tell him. "There is a debt on this property," she said finally. "I am trying to settle it." "Is it the bank in Coldwater?" She said nothing, which he apparently took as confirmation. He nodded slowly. "Hargrove's Bank. You know him." "I know of him. He has been buying up properties all over Comanche County. 2 families north of here lost their places to that bank last year. Good families, good farmers." There was something careful and restrained in his voice, the way a man sounds when he is keeping his opinion inside a fence. "How much do you owe?" she told him. The number sat between them on the table like a stone. Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is a lot of wheat." "I know what it is," she said, and there was a sharpness in her voice that she hadn't intended. She softened it. "I know the harvest may not cover all of it. But if I can pay down enough of the balance, the bank may be willing to extend the rest, or at least that is what I am hoping." "What happens if they are not willing?" She looked at the table. "Then Clara and I go to my sister's in Missouri, I suppose." The words were matter of fact, but they cost her something to say. She could feel that cost in the tightening of her throat, and she hoped very much that it did not show on her face. Frank set down his coffee cup. "That won't happen," he said. "You cannot know that." "No," he said, "but I intend to make sure that every possible thing that can be done to prevent it gets done." He said it quietly and simply, the way he said most things, without flourish or drama, and it was precisely the lack of drama that made it land so hard in the middle of her chest. She looked at him for a moment. He looked back at her. The lamp flickered in a draft from the window. "Mr. Monroe," she said carefully, "I appreciate your concern, but this is my problem to solve." "It doesn't have to be," he said. The room was very quiet. Outside, the Kansas wind moved through the wheat with a sound like breathing. "Good night, Mr. Monroe," Lillian said, and she picked up the harness leather again, and Frank Monroe stood up from the table and said good night and went out to the barn, and Lillian sat at the kitchen table for a long time after he left, staring at a piece of leather she was no longer mending. The weeks moved fast once the harvest started. The wheat came in better than she had dared hope. The drainage work Frank had done in the southeast corner had kept that section dry through a hard rain in mid-July, and the crop there was as good as anywhere else on the property. They worked from before sunrise until they could no longer see their hands in front of their faces, and at the end of each day Lillian tallied the cut sections against what remained and ran the numbers in her head until she had a figure she thought she could bring to market. She took the grain to Coldwater on a Saturday, Pete and Frank loading the wagon before dawn and Lillian driving Jasper the 12 miles into town, while they stayed to bring in the last of the north field. She sold the grain at the mill for a price that was fair by the standards of 1883, which meant it was not nearly as much as her labor had been worth, but it was what the market gave. She walked away from the mill with $287 in her coat pocket and a knot in her stomach the size of a fist. It was not enough. She was $125 short of the full balance, and she still did not know if the bank would accept a partial payment and extend the remaining debt. She drove home in the afternoon heat with the money in her pocket and the figures grinding through her head, and she was halfway back when she heard a horse coming up behind her at a trot. It was Frank Monroe. He pulled up alongside the wagon and matched Jasper's pace, and she glanced at him sidelong. "You were supposed to be finishing the north field," she said. "Pete is finishing the north field. I finished my rows." He rode beside her in silence for a moment. "How did it go?" $287. She heard him do the arithmetic the same way she had done it, quick and quiet. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "That's a significant portion. It is not the full amount." "No, but it is most of it. The bank wants all of it," Lillian said. "Or so Hargrove made clear when I spoke to him a few weeks ago." Frank rode beside her without speaking for a stretch of road, and the only sounds were Jasper's hooves and the creak of the wagon and the dry Kansas heat pressing down on everything. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the grass to the right of the road, bright and clean against all that dust and worry. "I want to help make up the difference," Frank said. Lillian gripped the reins tighter. "No, I have money saved, not a fortune, but no," her voice was flat. "I will not take your savings, Mr. Monroe. It would be a loan. You could pay me back after next year's harvest." "Frank." She said his name before she had thought about it, and then it was out there between them and she could not take it back. He looked at her, and she made herself look at him instead of at the road, which was harder. "You have been generous beyond any reasonable expectation. You have given weeks of your labor on this land. I will not take your money on top of it. That is my final word on the subject." He held her gaze for a moment with those steady eyes that did not argue and did not give way. "All right," he said at last. They rode in silence the rest of the way home, and the silence was different from the comfortable kind they had found in the kitchen in the evenings. This one had edges on it. She went to the bank on Monday morning. She sat across from Hargrove in his dark little office with its important furniture and its smell of pipe tobacco and money, and she put $287 on his desk in a neat stack and told him she was paying down the balance and requesting an extension on the remainder. Hargrove looked at the money for a long time. He told her the bank was not obligated to extend any credit to a borrower already in default. He told her that the foreclosure proceedings had been initiated and were continuing. He told her that the remaining balance, plus accumulated interest, now stood at $141, and that the bank required full and immediate settlement. Lillian looked at the man across the desk from her and felt a rage that she had been keeping carefully penned up for months press against its fence with considerable force. She kept her voice level. She told him that what he was describing was not a business arrangement, but a means of extracting land from people who lacked the political power to resist it. She told him that he and men like him had been doing it all over Comanche County, and that she was not fooled by the polite language he wrapped it in. Hargrove looked at her the way certain men look at women who say true things to them. He said the bank's position was final, and that she had 10 days remaining in the notice period. She drove home with the $287 still in her coat, because Hargrove had refused partial payment on grounds she did not fully understand and suspected were not entirely legal, and she was so angry that she did not trust herself to speak for the first several miles. When she got home, Frank was at the well, drawing water. He looked at her face as she climbed down from the wagon and said nothing, because he was a man who understood that sometimes you wait. She went into the house and stood in the kitchen for a long time with her hands flat on the table, breathing. Clara was at the neighbor's place 2 miles down the road, where she spent certain days with the Hendricks children. The house was quiet. Through the kitchen window Lillian could see the wheat fields, already cut, the stubble pale gold in the afternoon light. Daniel had broken this ground. They had built this house together, board by board, in the winter of '79 before the first planting season. She had given birth to Clara in the bedroom at the back of this house, and Daniel had held her hand through it and wept when the baby cried the first time, though he'd never admitted to the weeping. She heard Frank's boots on the porch step and then his knock on the door frame. "Mrs. Ellsworth." "Come in," she said, without turning from the window. He came in and stood near the door, hat in his hands. She could feel him reading her in the way he read things, carefully and without rushing. "The bank refused the partial payment," she said. He was quiet. "They want the full amount in 10 days. $141 plus the interest, which brings it to something like $150 altogether." She turned from the window. "I do not have it. I cannot get it in 10 days, and I cannot borrow it from you, Frank." She used his name again. It had become harder not to. "I understand that," he said. He was still turning his hat in his hands. "But there might be another way." "What way?" He put his hat on the table, a gesture that said he was settling in to talk. "Thaddeus Crane has been looking to buy the grazing rights to the south section of your land, the 40 acres that run along the creek. He'd pay for the right to run cattle on that section through the fall and winter. It would not affect your farming because you don't plant down there. You said the ground is too wet in spring." Lillian frowned. "Thaddeus Crane wants to lease grazing rights to my South 40. He mentioned it to me last month. He thought you might not want to discuss it so soon after Daniel passed, so he did not approach you directly. But if you were willing, he would pay enough to cover what you owe." Lillian turned this over in her mind. The South 40 was useless to her for farming. Daniel had known that, and so did she. It ran along a creek that flooded every spring, good for grass and for cattle, but not for any crop she could plant. She had never thought of it as an asset because it had never produced anything, but it produced grass all through the warm months, and it had water. "How much would he pay for the grazing rights?" she asked. "He told me he would go to $160 for a 3-year lease, paid in advance." The number was $287 plus $160, which was $447, which was more than enough to settle the debt and have something left over for next year's seed and supplies. Lillian sat down at the table. She looked at her hands. She thought about Hargrove and his pipe tobacco office and his assembled language of dispossession, and she thought about Daniel's wheat fields and Clara's bedroom, and the way the sunrise came through the east window in February and lit the whole kitchen gold. "Does Mr. Crane know about the foreclosure situation?" she asked. "Yes," Frank said. "He sent me here in March because he knew. He has been trying to find a way to help without offending your independence. He is a careful man." She looked up at Frank Monroe, who was standing by her kitchen table with his plain coat and his honest face, and she said, "This was not entirely about the harvest help at all, was it? You and Mr. Crane have been trying to find a way to keep this property from the bank since the beginning." He held her gaze. He did not apologize for it. "Daniel Ellsworth once saved the life of Thaddeus Crane's little brother," he said. "Crane has never forgotten that. And no," he added, quieter, "it was not only about the harvest." The kitchen was very still. "What else was it about?" she asked. The question hung between them, and neither of them looked away, and neither of them said anything for a moment that stretched long and warm and serious in the afternoon light. "I think you know," Frank said. She did know. She had known for some time now, and had been very deliberately not knowing it, because knowing it was complicated and dangerous, and not something she had any business thinking about when she had a child to protect and a property to save. She looked down at the table. "Frank," she said slowly, "I am a widow with a 9-year-old daughter and a farm that is 10 days from being taken by a bank. I am not in any position to—" "I am not asking you to be in any position," he said. "I am not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know that when this is settled, and it will be settled, I intend to ask your permission to call on you properly. If you tell me no, I will respect that completely, and I will go back to the rocking tea and not bother you again." He picked up his hat from the table. "But I could not leave you thinking that I didn't want to ask." Lillian looked at him for a long moment. Outside, a mourning dove called from somewhere near the barn, low and repetitive and very earnest. "Go get Mr. Crane's answer on the grazing lease," she said at last. "Get it in writing. And then we will go to the bank together and we will end this." Frank Monroe nodded. He put his hat on. He walked to the door and stopped with his hand on the frame, and she thought he was going to say something else. But instead, he just nodded again and went out to the barn to saddle his horse. Lillian sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that, and the feeling inside her chest was not quite as heavy as it had been for the last 14 months. Thaddeus Crane sent his written offer by way of Frank the following morning, and it was exactly as Frank had described. $160 paid in advance for a 3-year grazing lease on the South 40. The letter was written in a firm hand and was formal and clear and binding, the kind of document that Hargrove's bank could not argue with even if it wanted to. Lillian read it carefully at the kitchen table with Clara peering over her shoulder, and then she folded it and put it in her coat pocket alongside the grain money she had been carrying for the last 3 days. She looked at Frank and Pete across the table, where they were finishing their morning coffee. Pete Odell was watching her with quiet eyes that held a great deal more understanding than his usual silence suggested. Frank was watching her too, though he looked at the window when she caught him at it. "I'm going to Coldwater today," Lillian said. "I'm going to settle this account." "I'll drive you," Frank said immediately. She was going to say she could drive herself, which was true, but she thought about walking into Hargrove's office alone, and she thought about walking in with Frank Monroe at her shoulder, a solid and steady presence who stood 6 feet tall and had the look of someone who did not move easily once he had decided where he was standing, and she said, "All right." Pete stayed to keep an eye on the place. Clara went with them, sitting between Lillian and Frank on the wagon seat, asking a continuous stream of questions about Coldwater that neither of them could fully answer fast enough to keep up with her. They reached Coldwater in the late morning. The town was a modest collection of buildings along a main street that was wider than necessary and dusty in the heat, with a hardware store and a dry goods and a saloon and a livery. And at the far end, the brick facade of Coldwater Savings and Loan, which looked more substantial than anything around it in the deliberate way of institutions that want you to feel their permanence before they ask for your money. Lillian left Clara with the wagon under instruction not to go anywhere, and she and Frank went into the bank. Hargrove's secretary was a young man in a collar that was too tight for his neck, and he told them that Mr. Hargrove was in a meeting. Lillian told him that she would wait. She sat in the hard chair across from his desk and folded her hands in her lap and waited, and Frank stood near the door with his hat in his hands and his expression giving away nothing at all. And after 11 minutes Hargrove appeared from his back office looking both irritated and cautious in the way that men look when they are not sure whether the person they are irritated at is also a problem they have to be careful of. Lillian stood up. "Mr. Hargrove, I am here to settle the account on the Ellsworth property in full." She laid $287 in grain money on his desk and the signed grazing lease agreement from Thaddeus Crane beside it, and she explained its terms clearly and without hurry. The grazing lease was a signed legal instrument representing $160 in consideration to the Ellsworth property, and she was offering the full outstanding balance plus interest against the property debt, total amount $447 in cash and legal instrument. She wanted her deed returned to her free of any lien. Hargrove looked at the money and the document. He looked at Lillian. He looked at Frank Monroe, who was standing near the door with the still, settled quality of a man who had nowhere else to be and no particular inclination to leave without the thing he had come for. Hargrove said that the grazing lease was not the same as cash and that the bank preferred full cash settlement. Frank Monroe said, from near the door, in a very quiet and reasonable voice, that a signed 3-year lease from Thaddeus Crane of the Rocking T represented a very solid financial instrument that any attorney in the state of Kansas would confirm was equivalent to the cash value stated, and that if Mr. Hargrove was suggesting otherwise, he might want to think carefully about whether he wanted to make that argument in front of a judge. There was a long pause. Hargrove looked at the document again. He looked at Frank. He appeared to calculate something. He accepted the payment. The deed was produced. The lien was noted as satisfied in the bank's ledger. A receipt was written. Lillian signed where she needed to sign and received a copy of everything, and she stood up from the chair across from Hargrove's desk and looked at him for just a moment, not with triumph exactly, but with the clear-eyed, steady gaze of a woman who has just made something right that was wrong and knows it. She said, "Good day, Mr. Hargrove," and she walked out of the bank with the deed to her property in her hand, and Frank Monroe held the door for her, and Clara was waiting by the wagon and demanded to know if everything was all right, and Lillian sat down on the wagon seat and held the deed in both hands and said, "Yes, baby, everything is all right." Clara studied her mother's face and then looked at Frank Monroe, who had come to stand beside the wagon. "Are you going to keep helping us?" Clara asked him. Frank looked at Lillian. Lillian looked back at him, and the afternoon sun was behind him, and she had to shade her eyes to see his face properly, and there was a warmth in the expression on that face that she was not trying to talk herself out of anymore. "I hope too," he said. He was speaking to Clara, but he was looking at Lillian. "If your mother will allow it." Clara looked between them with the focused interest of a child who suspects that adults are communicating in a language she has not quite learned yet. Then she seemed to decide it was satisfactory. "Good," she said, and climbed into the wagon to wait. The drive back to the farm was easy and warm, and the three of them talked about small things: the quality of the soil they had seen on a side road, the question of whether there would be a good watermelon season, Clara's strong opinion that watermelons were the finest thing in the world, and that anyone who disagreed was simply wrong. The afternoon light stretched long and gold across the Kansas plain, and Lillian held the deed in her lap and listened to her daughter's voice, and felt something loosening in her chest that had been wound tight for 14 months. That evening after supper, after Clara was in bed and Pete had gone to the barn, Lillian and Frank sat on the porch in the last of the light. It was cooler than it had been for weeks, a clean breeze coming up from the south that smelled of grass and distance. Somewhere across the fields a whippoorwill was calling. "I would like to say something," Frank said, "if you are willing to hear it." "I am," she said. He turned in his chair to look at her. He had his forearms resting on his knees, and his hat was in his hands again, which she had come to recognize as the posture he took when he was about to say something he was taking seriously. "When I rode out here in March to deliver Thaddeus Crane's letter, I did not know you. I knew that you were Daniel Ellsworth's widow and that you were in trouble, and I came because Crane asked me to and because it seemed like the right thing to do. But in the time I have been here," he paused and looked at the hat in his hands. "In the time I have been here," he said again, "I have come to know you. And I want to tell you that I have not known many people like you, Lillian. You are the most capable and the most honest and the most—" He stopped again, and a faint color came up in his face that she found unexpectedly touching in a man of his size and solidity. "I am better at working than at talking," he said. "You are talking just fine," she said softly. He looked up at her. "I want to ask permission to court you, properly. I know that is a thing you may not be ready for, and I know that Daniel is not long gone, and I am not asking you to feel anything you don't feel. I am only asking if you will let me try." Lillian looked at this man, this Frank Monroe who had ridden onto her property 4.5 weeks ago on a roan horse with his hat pushed back, and had proceeded to fix her drainage and bring in her harvest, and stand at her back in a banker's office, and say the right things at the right moment without ever once making her feel small or in his debt. She thought about Daniel, who had been a good man, a loving man, and who would not have wanted her to spend the rest of her life alone on a Kansas prairie holding grief in her arms like a substitution for the living. "Yes," she said, "I will let you try." The whippoorwill called again, and the evening settled around them, and neither of them said anything else for a while, but the silence was the very best kind. Pete Odell went back to the rocking tee the following week. He shook Lillian's hand at the gate in the early morning and told her it had been a privilege to work her land, and she thanked him with a warmth that made his weathered face go slightly embarrassed. He told Frank something low that Lillian could not hear, and Frank told him something back, and Pete laughed and shook his head and rode away north toward the rocking tee, and that was that. Frank stayed. He did not stay in any way that was improper. He slept in the barn, and he worked the property during the days, and on certain evenings he stayed on the porch after supper and they talked. But he stayed, and the staying was deliberate and known, and Lillian found that she was glad of it in a way that she was no longer trying to talk herself out of. He was good with the land in the way that mattered, not just strong enough to work it but smart enough to think about it. He saw things she missed: a fence post that was pulling loose on the north side, a section of roof where the shingles had been laid wrong and would let in water come winter, a channel in the south field that could be redirected to improve the spring drainage on the wheat section for next year. He did these things without being asked, and without making a point of them, which was perhaps the most attractive quality he possessed, though the competition for that distinction was considerable. He asked her questions about herself, which was something she had not expected and which caught her off guard the first time it happened. She was used to men who asked about the land, the crops, the animals, the practical things. Frank asked about those too, but he also asked about her, where she had grown up, what she had wanted to be before she was anything, what she had loved before she came to Kansas. He listened to the answers in the particular way of someone who was actually storing what you told them, not just waiting for his turn to speak. She had grown up in Indiana, she told him. She had wanted to be a school teacher. She had loved the Ohio River and swimming in it in summer and reading on its banks and the way it looked in October when the trees along it went red and gold and the light came off the water in the afternoons. "Do you miss it?" he asked. "Sometimes," she said. "I love this land now, but sometimes I miss having a river." He nodded as if he was filing this away. She asked about him in return, which she realized she had been slow to do, having been so focused on her own immediate crisis that she had not asked enough. He told her about San Antonio, about his father who had been a Mexican War veteran and his mother who had been the daughter of a German immigrant rancher, and had raised Frank and his two brothers with a combination of strictness and affection that he described with obvious gratitude. He told her that both parents were gone now, his father 10 years ago, his mother 3, and that his brothers were in Texas still, one ranching and one who had become a lawyer in Corpus Christi. "A lawyer," she said. "You could have called on your brother instead of Frank Monroe when we were in Hargrove's office. My brother is 400 miles away and your 10 days were not going to accommodate the travel time," he said. She laughed, and the laughter surprised her a little, the easy fullness of it, the way it came without her having to prepare for it. She had not laughed like that in a long time, and it felt both strange and very natural. Clara, who had no patience for subtlety, informed Frank one morning at breakfast that she thought he should stay permanently, and that the south barn stall could be properly fitted out as a room if someone put up a proper wall and added a window. Frank said he appreciated the proposal, and that she made a compelling case, and that perhaps her mother had some thoughts on the matter. Clara turned to Lillian with an expression that was entirely too knowing for a 9-year-old, and Lillian told her to eat her eggs. But the idea settled in the back of her mind and stayed there. Summer moved into fall with the particular generosity that Kansas sometimes offered after a brutal year: long, warm days and cool, dry nights that made the sky look close and enormous. Lillian began planning for the next year's planting, and Frank was part of those conversations in a way that felt natural, his knowledge of the land and her knowledge of farming combining into something that was better than either of them separately. They stood at her kitchen table in the evenings with paper and pencil, planning the rotation, discussing the drainage improvements, talking about whether it was worth trying a section of corn alongside the wheat. He rode back to the rocking tee once a week to check in with Thaddeus Crane and do whatever work was required there, and Lillian found that the days he was gone had a different quality from the days he was there, a quieter and slightly grayer quality that she acknowledged to herself with full honesty for what it was. She missed him. She missed the sound of him working in the yard in the early morning, the way he talked to the animals, which he did with a straight-faced practicality that was somehow funnier than if he had been joking. She missed the evenings on the porch and the kitchen table discussions, and the way he always poured her coffee first. She missed the particular quality of feeling safe that she had not had since before Daniel's fever, the sense that someone else was also paying attention to the world, and that the weight of it did not have to be carried entirely alone. One day in early October, Frank rode back from the rocking T on the roan and dismounted at the gate and came across the yard to where Lillian was working on the kitchen garden, preparing the beds for winter, and she looked up at him and knew immediately that something was different. He had a look on his face that was careful and concentrated in a way that was distinct from his usual steadiness. He sat down on the overturned barrel near the garden fence and turned his hat in his hands. She put down her trowel and gave him her full attention because she had learned by now that when Frank Monroe turned his hat in his hands, he had something important to say. "I spoke to Thaddeus Crane today," he said. "I told him I would be leaving the rocking T." Lillian went very still. "He was good about it," Frank said. "He always knew it was likely." He looked at her. "I told him I intended to stay in Comanche County, that I had reasons to." The October light was thin and golden and fell across the garden in long stripes, and Lillian felt her heart doing something that was both nervous and entirely sure of itself. "What reasons?" she asked, and she was aware that her voice was not quite as steady as she wanted it to be. Frank stood up from the barrel, and he was tall against the sky, and the fields behind him were gold and pale with the cut stubble, and the whole thing looked like a painting of something, like the kind of scene that people describe later when they try to explain how love arrives. "You know what reasons," he said, "but I would like to say them plainly." "Say them plainly, then," she said. He crossed to the garden fence and stopped an arm's length from her, and he looked at her the way he had been looking at her since that first morning at the fence line, with a directness that was not aggressive but that did not hide itself either. "I love you, Lillian. I have been trying to find the right time to say it, and I have concluded that there is no right time. There is only the time you do it. I love you, and I want to marry you if you will have me, and I want to spend whatever time God gives me working this land beside you and watching your daughter grow up and making a life here." He paused. "I am not a man of property. I have my savings, what remains of them, my horse, my saddle, and my tools. I am offering you a man who will work harder than any man you have ever met, and who will be faithful to you and honest with you every day of his life." Lillian Ellsworth, who had kept herself steady through 14 months of grief and financial terror and physical exhaustion, felt tears press at the backs of her eyes and let them come, because she was not going to hide from this. She stepped forward and took both of his hands in hers, which were rough from the same work that had made his rough, and she looked up at his face. "I love you too," she said. "I have for some time. I have been trying to be sensible about it." "How is the sensible approach working?" "Very poorly," she said. He laughed, a deep, real laugh that she felt through his hands, and then he let go of her hands and put his arms around her instead, and she put her face against the front of his coat, and for a moment they just stood in the garden in the October light with the Kansas wind moving through what was left of the year's growth around them. "Yes," she said, against his coat. "I will marry you." He tightened his arms around her, and she felt him exhale slowly, as if he had been holding that breath for a long time. Clara appeared at the back porch and surveyed the scene in the garden with the expression of someone whose careful planning had just come to its intended fruition. "Are you getting married?" she called. "Go back inside," Lillian said, without moving from where she was. "I am choosing to take that as a yes," Clara said, and went back inside. They were married in November, in the small white church in Coldwater that was not much to look at from the outside, but that had inside it a preacher named Reverend Dalton, who had been in Kansas since the 50s, and had married and buried more people than he could count, and who had a voice that made you feel that whatever words he was speaking were true and permanent. Thaddeus Crane came from the rocking T with his wife, a sharp-eyed woman named Dorothy, who took one look at Lillian and clearly approved. Pete Odell came too, cleaner than Lillian had ever seen him, his salt and pepper beard trimmed for the occasion. The Hendricks family came, neighbors and friends, and several other families from the county who knew Lillian and thought well of her. Frank wore a proper suit that he had purchased in Coldwater with an expression that suggested he found suits somewhat disagreeable, but was prepared to endure this one for the occasion. He looked, Lillian thought, absolutely wonderful in it, though she would have said so out loud only if forced. Clara wore a dress that Lillian had made from the nicest cotton she could find in the dry goods store, white with a blue ribbon at the waist, and she stood next to her mother during the ceremony with an expression of profound seriousness that broke the composure of at least 3 adults in attendance. When Reverend Dalton asked Frank if he took Lillian as his wife, Frank said, "I do," in a voice that was quiet and entirely certain, and Lillian felt the words settle into her like something coming home to rest. When Reverend Dalton asked Lillian the same, she said, "I do," and she meant it with every part of herself. The reception was at the church hall, simple and warm and full of good food that the neighboring women had contributed, and dancing that went later than anyone had planned because the fiddler from the rocking tea turned out to be genuinely skilled, and the music was too good to stop. Frank danced badly and without any apparent concern about dancing badly, which was one more thing Lillian added to her list of reasons to love him. They drove home in the dark, Clara asleep between them on the wagon seat, the November sky enormous and cold and full of stars. Frank drove with one hand on the reins and the other around Lillian's shoulders, and she leaned into him and watched the stars and felt something that was not a forgetting of grief, but a carrying of it into something new. The way water carries what the land gives it and becomes something different for the carrying. When they got home, Frank carried Clara in and laid her in her bed without waking her, and he was so careful about it, so deliberate in the gentleness of it, that Lillian stood in the doorway and watched and felt a fullness in her chest that was almost too large for the room. He saw her watching as he straightened up from the bedside. He crossed to the door and she stepped back into the hallway, and he followed and pulled the door softly closed behind them, and he cupped her face in his hands in the hallway dark and kissed her, really kissed her for the first time, and it was everything that a first kiss ought to be, tender and serious and full of the weight of the future. The first winter of their marriage was hard in the way that Kansas winters were hard, cold that had real teeth in it, and a stretch of storms in February that kept them close to the house for days at a time. But it was the best winter Lillian had ever spent in Kansas, and she knew the difference was not the weather. Frank proved himself true to every word he had said in the garden that October day. He worked the land with a dedication that matched hers, and they found in the daily work of it a kind of partnership that was both practical and intimate, built out of shared decisions and shared labor, and the thousand small exchanges of two people managing a life together. He was patient with Clara in a way that was never forced, and Clara, who was smart enough to recognize authenticity, moved naturally and without drama into calling him Papa sometime in the late winter, without any fanfare or announcement. Just one morning at breakfast the word was there, and Frank went very still for a moment, and then said something about the weather with a voice that was slightly rougher than usual, and neither he nor Lillian made a production of it. The spring planting season of '84 came in fine. The drainage work Frank had done the previous summer showed its worth immediately, the southeast corner draining cleanly through a wet April that would have previously flooded it out. They planted a larger wheat section than Lillian had ever managed alone, and Frank put in a section of corn as they had discussed, and by early summer the fields looked as good as anything in the county. In May, Lillian told Frank that she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen after supper, with Clara in bed, the way she had told him other important things, sitting across the table from him in the lamplight. Frank sat very still for a moment after she said it, and then he stood up from the table and came around to her side and pulled her up out of the chair and held her for a long time without saying anything, and she could feel his heart beating hard against hers, and she closed her eyes and held on. "Are you happy?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "I don't have a word for what I am," he said into her hair. The baby came in December of 1884, a boy, born in the bedroom where Clara had been born 5 years before Daniel had died, though the circumstances were considerably different this time. Frank paced the front room for 4 hours while Lillian labored with the help of Dorothy Crane, who had delivered half the babies in Comanche County, and who ran the bedroom with the efficiency of a general. Frank appeared in the doorway the moment Dorothy called him in, and he sat beside Lillian and held her hand, and did not once complain about the pressure she was applying to his fingers, which was extraordinary given the amount of pressure she was applying. The boy was born just after midnight, healthy and loud, with Frank's dark eyes and Lillian's square jaw, and a pair of lungs that announced themselves to the entire household without ambiguity. Frank held his son for the first time in the lamplight of the bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed beside Lillian, and his face had an expression on it that she had not seen before, something open and overwhelmed and completely defenseless that was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen on a human face. "What do we name him?" she asked. They had discussed several names. They had not decided, but Frank looked at the baby in his arms and said, without any hesitation, "Daniel." Lillian looked at him, he looked at her. "Daniel Monroe," he said, "if you are willing." She reached up and put her hand against his face. "I am willing," she said. Clara appeared in the doorway in her nightgown, having heard the commotion, and decided that no one could reasonably expect her to stay in bed through an event of this magnitude. She looked at the baby in Frank's arms with an expression that cycled rapidly through several stages before settling on something that was clearly and completely love. "He is very small," she said. "He will grow," Frank said. "Can I hold him?" "Tomorrow," Lillian said. "Come and see him now and then go back to bed." Clara came to the bedside and looked at her brother with a seriousness that was absolute. She reached out one finger and touched his hand, and the baby's hand closed around the finger with the instinctive grip of the newborn, and Clara's face did something that Lillian would remember for the rest of her life. "Hello, Daniel," Clara said, softly and privately, as if she was introducing herself to someone she already knew she was going to love very much. The years that followed were the years that Lillian had worked toward without knowing exactly what she was working toward, the years when life stopped being a crisis to be survived and became a thing to be lived. The Ellsworth Monroe farm, which was what the county came to call it, though the deeds still read Ellsworth because that was the name on the land, grew in stages and in keeping with what the ground and the market and their labor could support. The corn section proved profitable, and they expanded it in '86. Frank added a proper second barn in '87, building most of it himself with help from the Hendricks men and Pete Odell, who had settled on a small plot of his own 2 miles south, and became something close to a fixture at their dinner table. Clara, who had indeed been born with her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn chin, grew into exactly the person those features suggested she would, sharp and funny, and as stubborn as the Kansas plain when she had decided something was right. She finished the local school at 15 and told her mother and Frank that she intended to be a teacher, and Lillian felt something circle back and complete itself in the hearing of it. They arranged for her to continue her education in Wichita with a woman named Mrs. Portman, who ran a boarding house for girls studying at the normal school there. It cost money they had to plan for carefully, but they planned for it carefully, and it was done. Daniel Monroe grew up the way children grow on working land, in full sun, with dirt on his hands and animals for companions, and a working knowledge of the natural world that no formal school could have given him. He had Frank's steadiness and Lillian's quick mind, and he was the kind of boy that people trusted instinctively, the kind who said what he meant and meant what he said. By the time he was 4, he was following Frank around the farm with the focused concentration of someone learning a trade, and Frank taught him with a patience and a joy that Lillian watched from a distance sometimes, and felt so full of gratitude for that it came close to aching. In the spring of 1887, Lillian found herself expecting again. She told Frank in the kitchen again, the same way she had told him the first time, and he came around the table and held her the same way, and she thought that some rituals were worth repeating. The second child was a girl, born in the fall, and they named her Martha, which had been Frank's mother's name. She arrived with a quantity of dark hair, and an expression that the delivering midwife described as extremely opinionated, which proved prescient. Martha Monroe was the loudest and most determined person on the Ellsworth Monroe farm from her first day, and she remained so for all the days that followed, in the best possible way. The winter of '87 was mild, as Kansas winters went, and Lillian and Frank sat on the porch on a warm December evening, which was unusual enough to deserve a sitting on the porch, with Daniel asleep inside and the baby Martha in the cradle near the fire and the stars doing what Kansas stars did in winter, which was turn the whole sky into something that made you feel both very small and very grateful. "Do you remember," Lillian said, "when I burned the foreclosure notice?" Frank turned his head to look at her. "You told me about that," he said. "You were there," she said. "Not in the house, but you were outside. You told me once that you had seen the smoke from my chimney when you rode up that morning and that you had thought about what might be burning." He was quiet for a moment. The stars were very clear. "I thought it might be paper," he said. "There was something about the way the smoke was coming. It had that quality." "What quality?" "Light," he said. "The way paper burns. It goes light and quick. I thought about it on the way back to the rocking tea." He paused. "I thought about whatever it was you had burned and why you had burned it." "And what did you conclude?" "That you were a woman who had decided something," he said. "I did not know what, but I thought about it for the whole 12 miles. He looked at her sideways. "I went back to Crane that evening and told him we needed to find a way to help you that you would actually accept." "That was the grazing lease idea," she said. "That was the beginning of the grazing lease idea," he said. "It took a few more conversations to get there, but yes." Lillian looked at the sky. "I burned that foreclosure notice because I was angry and because it was all I could do in that moment. It was not a plan. It was just the only act of defiance I had available to me." "I know," he said. "But I think it mattered. I think if you had not burned it, if you had folded it carefully and put it in a drawer and handled it like a grown and sensible person, I would have seen a woman managing a difficulty. But because you burned it, I saw a woman who was not going to be beaten by it." Lillian thought about this. "And that made a difference." "It made every difference," he said simply. She reached over and took his hand in the dark. He turned it over and held hers, and they sat on the porch of the house that Daniel Ellsworth had helped build and that Lillian had kept through everything that had tried to take it from her, and the Kansas night was vast and cold and extraordinarily beautiful around them. "I think about him," she said quietly. "Daniel, I want you to know that I do and that I always will and that it does not diminish what I have with you." "I know," Frank said. "I know it doesn't. And I would not want you not to think about him. He was Clara's father and he built this house and he loved you. Those things are real and they belong here." She tightened her hand around his. There was something in what he had just said that was the most loving thing she had ever heard a person say, the generosity of it, the completeness of it. She did not have words for it that were adequate, so she said none, and the silence held it better than words would have. The years of the late '80s and the early '90s brought the full weight of what it meant to farm in Kansas, the dry years and the wet years, the years when the grasshoppers came and the years when they didn't, the years when the market paid fairly and the years when it did not. They were not immune to any of it. In 1889, there was a drought that took most of the corn section and half the wheat, and they spent that winter more careful with money than they had been since the foreclosure year. Frank picked up work at the rocking tea through the winter to supplement what the farm brought in, and Lillian sold eggs and butter and took in mending, and they managed. They always managed, because they were two people who had decided that they were going to manage, and that decision turned out to be very durable. Clara came home from Wichita in the spring of '90 with her teaching certificate, and a young man from Wichita named Thomas Hart, whom she introduced to her family with a combination of pride and mild terror that Lillian recognized as the expression of someone in love who has not yet been sure how the people they love most will react. Frank shook Thomas Hart's hand and asked him 3 questions about his intentions and his character that were not hostile but were also not casual, and Thomas Hart answered them straight, and Frank said, "Good," and poured him a glass of cider, and that was more or less that. Clara married Thomas Hart in the summer of '90 and moved to Wichita, where she taught at the elementary school and where Thomas worked for the railroad. She was, by all available evidence, very happy, and she came home to the farm twice a year, and her children, when they came, called Frank and Lillian Grandma and Grandpa with the blithe ease of children who have never known any other arrangement. The South 40 that had provided the grazing lease that saved the property continued to provide, Thaddeus Crane renewing the lease every 3 years at a rate that reflected his gratitude and his friendship and his genuine good character. He died in '93, and Dorothy took over the rocking tea with a competence that nobody in the county was surprised by, and she renewed the lease herself because it was good business and because she liked Lillian. Daniel Monroe grew up and stayed on the farm, which was what he had always intended to do, and which Frank and Lillian had never pushed him toward but had not discouraged either. By the time he was 18, he was running the corn section himself, making his own decisions about planting and rotation, and dealing at the market in Coldwater with the steady directness that was his father's manner carried forward into a new face. He fell in love with the second of the Hendricks daughters, a girl named Ruth who was 20 and had grown up on the neighboring property, and who came to the Ellsworth Monroe farm so often she practically lived there already. They married in '96 in the Coldwater Church, the same white church where Frank and Lillian had married 13 years before, and it was something to stand in that church again and feel the continuity of it. Martha Monroe, the opinionated one, became a nurse. She told her parents this when she was 16, and she was still telling them at 19 when she left for training in Kansas City, brooking no argument from anyone about whether it was suitable or safe or practical, because she was Martha Monroe, and the idea of anyone telling Martha Monroe what was suitable for her had always been somewhat theoretical. She wrote letters home every week without fail, long detailed letters full of what she was seeing and learning and thinking, and Lillian kept every one of them in a box under the bed. The farm grew in the way that good farms grow over decades, not dramatically but steadily, each year adding something small that compounded over time into something substantial. Frank built a proper farmhouse in '91, a real house with real plastered walls and glass in every window and a proper wood floor throughout, and he built it around the original structure, so that the first room Lillian and Daniel had built together was still there inside the new walls, still present, still part of the whole. Lillian noticed this and did not say anything about it for a while. Then one evening after the house was finished and they had moved properly into it, she said, "You built around the original room on purpose." "Yes," Frank said. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. He was sitting in the chair by the fireplace, the first proper fireplace he had ever built, and he was quietly proud of it, and the firelight was doing the same thing lamplight had always done on his face, making it warm and readable. "Because it belonged here," he said, "and because you built it, both of you. And it would have been wrong to take it out." She sat across from him and looked at the fire and thought that the man she had chosen, the man who had ridden up her road on a roan horse in March of 1883, was one of the finest human beings she had ever known. She had thought so for years. She thought so now with the steady and uncomplicated certainty of something that has been proved past doubt. "Frank," she said. "Yes. I would burn that notice 100 times," she said, "if it meant you came back." He looked at her across the firelight, and his face did the thing it sometimes did, the open and slightly defenseless thing, the thing that was better than any declaration. "I was always going to come back," he said. "I just needed a reason." She smiled, and the fire crackled and the Kansas night pressed against the new glass windows, and the house held everything it was supposed to hold, the past and the present and the sound of the future moving through the wheat outside like breathing. Pete Odell came to Sunday dinner most weeks until he was too old to ride easily, and then Daniel brought him in the wagon. He sat at the head of the table extension, next to Lillian, and ate whatever was in front of him with the appreciation of a man who had eaten alone for most of his life and had never quite stopped being grateful for company. He told Daniel's children stories about the harvest of '83 with an enthusiasm that grew with each telling, and the children never tired of hearing them. In the fall of 1897, Lillian and Frank Ellsworth Monroe sat on the porch the way they had sat on every porch of their marriage, in the long October light that turned the cut fields gold and made the sky look like something painted with intention. Frank's hair had gone considerably gray at the temples, which Lillian privately found very good-looking and had told him so to his considerable embarrassment. Her own hair had a silver thread through the brown that had appeared after Martha's birth and had grown more prominent each year, which she accepted with equanimity. They were 45 and 48 years old. They had been married 14 years. They had 2 children of their own and Clara, who was theirs in every way that mattered. They had a farm that was their own and owed nothing to any bank. They had, in the fullest sense, a life. The wheat in the south field was cut, and in a good season, a fair price at the mill. Daniel and Ruth's first child, a boy they had named Frank after his grandfather, was asleep in the house because Ruth and Daniel had gone to Coldwater, and the grandparents had taken the baby for the day with the unambiguous enthusiasm of people who had been waiting for this opportunity for some time. The baby was 7 months old and had shown an early interest in being carried and a firm opposition to being set down, which Frank Monroe Sr. handled by simply not setting him down, carrying his grandson around the farm for most of the morning, and showing him things as if the baby were capable of appreciating the explanations, which he delivered anyway on principle. Lillian watched Frank walk back toward the house in the afternoon light with the baby on his shoulder, the baby's small fist clenched in Frank's collar and Frank's hand holding him steady and secure. And she felt the same fullness she had been feeling for 14 years, that quality of something abundant and real and exactly right. He came up to the porch and sat down in his chair, and the baby opened his dark eyes and looked at the Kansas sky with the profound focus of the very young, and Frank looked at Lillian, and Lillian looked at Frank. "Remember March of '83, she said. "Every day," he said. "What did you think when you first saw this place?" He considered the question with the seriousness he gave to most things. "I thought it was a beautiful piece of land," he said. "I thought the house needed work. I thought the woman at the fence had arms that were wound tighter than a clock spring." He glanced at her, in the most admirable possible way. "And what did you think when you rode away?" "That I intended to come back," he said, "with a different reason than the one that brought me." The baby on his shoulder made a small sound, and Frank shifted him gently, and the baby subsided, content. The sun was getting low. In the south field, the stubble caught the last of it and glowed. "You brought different papers," Lillian said. "I did," he said, "the lease agreement, which was Crane's idea, but I was the one who argued for it." "You saved this place," she said. "You saved this place," he said. "You saved it every day for 14 months before I ever got here. I just helped at the end." She shook her head. "We saved it," she said, "together." He held out his free hand toward her, and she took it, the way she had taken it across a garden fence in October of '83, and it was the same hand, rougher now and more marked by years, and hers were the same, and the weight between them was the weight of everything that was good. "Together," he agreed. The Kansas sky went from gold to amber to the deep, clean blue of oncoming evening, and the first stars came out one at a time above the fields, and Frank Monroe and Lillian Ellsworth Monroe sat on their porch in the country they had made their own, holding their grandson and each other, while the night came on gentle and full and completely at peace. In the house behind them, the fire was burning in the hearth Frank had built. Daniel and Ruth's wagon was visible in the distance, coming back up the road from Coldwater, raising a small dust. A mockingbird somewhere near the fence line ran through everything it knew, one song after another in the failing light, as if there were not time enough to say all of it, as if the whole beautiful unfinished catalog of sound had to be gotten through before the dark. And it did. And it was. And the night came down warm and full of stars, and the land that Lillian had kept and Frank had come back to lay still and breathing beneath all of it, patient and generous and entirely theirs.